Jake Miller had been working the graveyard shift at the intergalactic transit hub for almost 3 years now. Station Kepler 442b wasn't the worst place to end up, but it wasn't great either. It was one of those massive waypoints where ships from all over the galaxy stopped to refuel, restock, and move on. Hundreds of alien species passed through every single day. Tall ones, short ones, ones that floated, ones that slithered. After a while, Jake stopped being amazed by it all. To most of them, he was just part of the furniture. Another human with a mop and bucket. Humans didn't rank high in the galactic pecking order. Sure, Earth had joined the wider universe about 50 years back, but mostly humans ended up doing the jobs nobody else wanted. Cleaning, waste management, basic maintenance. The kind of work that kept the station running but that nobody really thought about. Jake didn't mind too much. The pay was decent enough, and the overnight shift meant he didn't have to deal with crowds. Just him, his cleaning cart, and whatever mess the day's shift left behind. It was a Tuesday night, or at least what passed for Tuesday on the station's artificial schedule, when everything changed. Jake was working his way through Docking Bay 7, which serviced the larger cargo vessels. The bay was empty except for a few scattered containers waiting to be processed in the morning. The lights were dimmed to save power, casting long shadows across the metal floor. Jake had his headphones in, listening to some old rock music from Earth, when he heard something that made him pause. A sound, high-pitched and desperate, almost like crying, but not quite human. He pulled out one earbud and listened. There it was again, coming from near the refuse compactor area, where damaged or unclaimed cargo usually got dumped before being destroyed. Jake's first instinct was to ignore it. That was rule 1 of station life. Mind your business, do your job, go home. But the sound came again, weaker this time, and something in his chest tightened. He'd always been that way, even as a kid. Couldn't ignore an animal in distress. His mom used to say it would get him in trouble someday. He walked toward the compactor, following the sound. There, wedged between 2 larger containers, was a smaller cargo box. It was banged up pretty bad, with scorch mark along one side and a corner completely caved in. But what caught Jake's attention were the symbols painted on the side. Even in the dim light, he recognized them. Draconian Empire markings. His stomach dropped. Dragons. Of all the species in the galaxy, dragons were the ones you absolutely did not mess with. They controlled 3 entire star systems with military might that made Earth's combined forces look like children with water guns. They were huge, they were powerful, and they had a reputation for solving problems with fire and claws first, questions never. The crying sound came again from inside the container. Jake stood there for a long moment, his practical brain warring with something deeper. He should walk away. Report it to station security in the morning. Let someone else handle it. Someone who got paid enough to deal with dragon business. But the sound was so small. So scared. Jake cursed it under his breath and looked around. The bay was completely empty. No cameras in this section. They'd been broken for months and maintenance hadn't gotten around to fixing them yet. He grabbed a pry bar from his cart and wedged it into the container's damaged corner. The metal groaned and gave way. Inside, huddled in a nest of shredded packing material, were 2 of the smallest, most pitiful creatures Jake had ever seen. Dragon hatchlings. They couldn't have been bigger than house cats, though their bodies were built like tiny dinosaurs. One had scales that shimmered copper even in the low light. The other was silver. Their wings were torn, hanging at awkward angles, and both were covered in cuts and bruises. The copper one had a deep gash along its side that was still oozing dark blue blood. They looked up at Jake with huge, golden eyes filled with pain and fear. The silver one tried to hiss at him, a pathetic little sound, while the copper one just whimpered. Jake's hands were shaking. This was bad. This was worse than bad. Dragon young were supposed to be the most protected creatures in the galaxy. They were never seen outside dragon space, guarded by entire fleets and warrior castes. Finding 2 of them here, abandoned and dying in a cargo container, meant something had gone terribly wrong. It meant politics, conspiracies, the kind of dangerous situations that got people killed for knowing too much. Every logical part of Jake's brain screamed at him to close the container and walk away. But he looked at those 2 small, suffering creatures, and he knew he couldn't do it. It wasn't in him. Maybe that made him stupid. Maybe that was why humans were still cleaning floors while other species ran things. But he couldn't leave them to die in a trash compactor. Jake looked around one more time, then carefully scooped up both hatchlings. They were surprisingly light, their bones probably hollow like earth birds. The copper one made a small chirping sound and tried to burrow into his jacket. The silver one watched him with suspicious but desperate eyes. He tucked them both inside his maintenance uniform, zipped up his jacket, and grabbed his cleaning cart. His heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. If anyone stopped him, if anyone searched him, he was done. But the station was quiet, and Jake knew every camera blind spot, every unused corridor. 3 years of invisible janitorial work had taught him how to move through the station like a ghost. 20 minutes later, he was back in his quarters, a tiny studio apartment in the station's lower residential ring. The kind of place that was barely bigger than a closet, but was all a human janitor could afford. He laid the hatchlings carefully on his bed and stared at them, reality finally catching up with adrenaline. What had he just done? Jake stood in his tiny apartment staring at 2 injured dragon hatchlings on his bed, and the full weight of what he'd done hit him like a freight train. He'd just stolen property of the Draconian Empire, or saved 2 lives, depending on how you looked at it. Either way, he was in deep trouble if anyone found out. The copper-scaled hatchling made a weak chirping sound, and Jake snapped back to reality. Right. Injured creatures first, existential crisis later. He grabbed his tablet and started searching the station's medical database. Dragon physiology, dragon first aid, anything that might help. Most of the information was restricted, but he found some basic stuff. Their blood was copper-based, which explained the blue color. They had accelerated healing if they were kept warm and fed protein. Their scales were naturally antimicrobial but could get infected if damaged badly enough. Jake looked at his bank account and winced. He had maybe enough credits saved up for 2 months of rent. But there was a black market medical supply shop in the lower decks that didn't ask questions. He grabbed his jacket, looked at the hatchlings one more time, and locked his door behind him. 3 hours and his entire month's salary later, Jake returned with antibacterial gel, synthetic tissue patches, protein supplements, and a heating lamp normally used for reptilian species. The guy selling the stuff had given him a long look but hadn't asked questions. That was the thing about the lower decks. Everyone had something to hide. Jake spent the rest of that night and the next 2 days taking care of them. He cleaned their wounds as gently as he could while they whimpered and chirped. He used the tissue patches on the worst cuts, especially the deep gash on the copper one side. He set up the heating lamp and watched their scales gradually brighten from dull gray to their proper metallic colors. He mashed up the protein supplements with water and hand-fed them, tiny amounts at first because he was terrified of making things worse. He called in sick to work for 3 days straight, something he'd never done before. His supervisor sounded annoyed but didn't push it. Humans got sick sometimes. Nobody cared enough to check. By the 4th day, the hatchlings were moving around more. Their wings were still healing, but they could stretch them a bit. They started following Jake around his tiny apartment, their claws clicking on the metal floor. The copper one seemed braver, always staying close to his feet. The silver one was more cautious, watching everything with those intelligent golden eyes. Jake started calling them Ember and Ash. He knew they probably had their own names in whatever language Dragon spoke, but he needed something to call them. Ember, the copper one, seemed to like it when he talked to her. She'd tilt her head and make little chirping sounds back, like she was trying to understand English. Ash would just watch, always alert, always analyzing. On the 5th day, Jake had to go back to work. He couldn't afford to lose his job, not now. He set up food and water for Ember and Ash, checked that his door was locked about 5 times, and headed out for his shift. He couldn't concentrate the whole time. Every noise made him jump. Every security officer that walked by made his heart race. But nothing happened. He came home to find both hatchlings curled up together under the heating lamp, safe. That became the routine. Jake would work his shifts, come home, take care of Ember and Ash. They grew stronger every day. Dragons healed fast. He learned. Way faster than humans or most other species. Within a week, their wings were mostly healed and they could manage short flights across his apartment. Ember figured it out first and face planted into his couch cushions about a dozen times before getting the hang of it. Ash watched her mistakes and then nailed it on his second try. They were smart, scary smart. Jake would talk to them while he cleaned their food bowls or changed the heating lamp settings, and they'd watch him like they understood every word. Sometimes Ember would chirp back at specific words. Food, water, safe, like she was learning. On the sixth night, something happened that changed everything. Jake was asleep when he heard his door rattling. Someone was trying to force it open. His apartment was in a rough section of the station, and break-iron nests weren't uncommon. He sat up, heart pounding, trying to figure out what to do. He didn't own any weapons. Station regulations didn't allow humans to carry anything serious. The door burst open and a large alien stumbled in. A Zentari, one of the four-armed species that worked security for some of the shadier cargo operations. He was clearly drunk, probably thought this was his own apartment or was looking for something to steal. Before Jake could even move, Ember launched herself off the bed. The little copper dragon, barely 2 feet long, positioned herself between Jake and the intruder. She spread her healing wings, opened her mouth, and released a burst of flame about the size of a softball. It wasn't much. A full-grown dragon could melt through steel blast doors. But for a hatchling barely a week into recovery, it was impressive. And more importantly, it was hot enough to singe the Zentari's fur and scare him sober. The alien yelped, scrambled backward, and ran out of the apartment so fast he left one of his boots behind. Jake sat frozen on his bed. Ember turned around, chirped proudly, and hopped back onto the covers like nothing had happened. Ash had been ready to join her, crouched with his small claws extended. But now he relaxed too. That was the moment Jake realized these weren't just injured animals he was nursing back to health. They saw him as something more. Pack. Family. Someone worth protecting. Over the next day, Jake spent every free moment researching. He used his tablet's encrypted browser and dug through galactic databases, careful to cover his tracks. What he found made his blood run cold. Dragon hatchlings were never, ever seen outside Draconian space. They were protected by massive military forces. Royal hatchlings were even more secure, guarded in fortress nurseries. For two to end up in a random cargo container on a backwater station meant something huge and dark. Smuggling, assassination plots, political conspiracies at the highest levels. Jake also learned something else. Something that made his hands shake as he read it. Dragon hatchlings could bond with other species, but only rarely. Only if someone saved their lives when they were vulnerable. And once bonded, it was permanent. For life. He looked over at Ember and Ash, both curled up in a patch of heating lamplight, trusting in content. They'd chosen him. A human janitor who made barely enough to afford rent. These creatures who would someday grow into massive, powerful beings that could level buildings and command fleets. They'd bonded with him. Jake buried his face in his hands. He couldn't keep them. His apartment was barely big enough for himself. Dragons grew fast. In a few months, they'd be too big to hide. And someone would come looking eventually. Someone always did. He needed to contact the Draconian embassy, get them home safely. But every human he'd carefully asked had said the same thing. Dragons don't forgive. Dragons don't forget. They'd want to know how he found the hatchlings, why he took them, what he knew, and they might decide the safest option was making sure he never talked. Jake was still trying to figure out what to do when, on the 7th night, he came home from his shift and found his apartment door already open. His blood turned to ice. This was it. Someone had found out. He stepped inside slowly, and his worst nightmare was standing in his living room. The being standing in Jake's apartment was something out of a nightmare. Nearly 8 feet tall, with scales that looked like they'd been forged from actual gold, shimmering even in the dim light of Jake's cheap apartment. He was in what Jake's research called a semi-humanoid form, walking on 2 legs with a mostly upright posture, but there was nothing human about him. His face was distinctly draconic, with a long snout filled with teeth that could probably bite through steel. His eyes glowed like embers in a fire, ancient and intelligent, and currently fixed directly on Jake. 4 guards stood behind him, each one nearly as massive, wearing armor that looked like it cost more than Jake would make in his entire lifetime. They carried weapons that hummed with barely contained energy, the kind of weapons that could vaporize a human before he even knew he was being shot at. Jake's apartment had never felt smaller. These beings filled the space like they were made of compressed power. The air itself felt heavy, charged with something primal that made every instinct in Jake's body scream to run. But there was nowhere to run to. His back was against the door. His legs felt like jelly. Then he heard it. Chirping. Excited. Happy chirping. Ember and Ash launched themselves across the room, their wings beating frantically. They flew straight to the massive golden dragon, circling around his head and chirping like excited puppies. The dragon caught them gently, one in each clawed hand, and examined them carefully. His expression was impossible to read, but his hands were surprisingly tender as he checked their wings, ran his fingers over their healing scales, inspected the tissue patches Jake had applied. He spoke to them in a language that sounded like music mixed with distant thunder. It was beautiful and terrifying at the same time. The hatchlings chirped back, nuzzling against his scales. Then those burning eyes turned back to Jake, and the dragon spoke in perfect English. "You are the human who saved my children." Jake's mouth had gone completely dry. His brain was trying to process the words. My children. This wasn't just any dragon. This was their father. And based on the way the guard stood at attention, the quality of that armor, the sheer presence of the being in front of him, this was someone very, very important. "I." Jake's voice came out as a croak. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Your Majesty. Sir, I didn't know they were yours. I just found them in a cargo container. They were hurt. I couldn't just leave them there." The dragon studied him for a long moment. Jake felt like those eyes were looking right through him, seeing every thought, every fear, every secret he'd ever had. It was the most uncomfortable he'd ever felt in his life. "My name is Calitha," the dragon said, his voice resonating through the small apartment like distant thunder. "King of the Draconian Empire. These are my son and daughter, Emboithex and Ashkeller." He pronounced their full names in that musical language, and Jake realized his simple nicknames had accidentally been pretty close. They were stolen from the royal nursery 3 weeks ago by conspirators within my own court, traitors who sought to weaken my bloodline and destabilize the empire. Jake's legs were shaking now. This was so much worse than he'd imagined. Royal hatchlings, stolen in a political conspiracy. And he'd stumbled right into the middle of it. "Every ship in my fleet has been searching," Calitha continued. "Every intelligence agent, every ally, every resource of the Empire deployed to find them. We traced the smugglers to this station 2 days ago, tracked their ship to this docking bay, found the empty container." His eyes narrowed slightly. And then nothing. The trail went cold. Until this morning, when one of my scouts detected traces of royal scent leading to the residential quarters. To this door. One of the guards, a massive red scale dragon, stepped forward. His voice was harsh and aggressive. "Sire, we should eliminate the witness. He knows too much about the conspiracy, about the security failures. A human cannot be trusted with this information." Jake's heart stopped. He looked at Ember and Ash, still cradled in their father's hands. They were safe now. That was what mattered, right? He'd saved them, got them home. Even if this was how it ended for him, at least he'd done that. But then Ember did something unexpected. She made a loud, distressed chirping sound and launched herself out of her father's hand. She flew straight to Jake and landed on his shoulder, pressing her small body against his neck. Ash hesitated for only a moment before doing the same, taking up position on Jake's other shoulder. Both of them were making agitated sounds, their wings spread protectively. The king's eyes widened. The guard stiffened. The temperature in the room seemed to drop about 10 degrees. "Interesting," Calitha said softly. He waved the guard back and took a step closer to Jake. Jake wanted to back up, but there was nowhere to go, and he was terrified that moving might upset Ember and Ash. "Tell me, human, what is your name?" "Jake Miller, sir. Your Majesty. I'm just a janitor. I work the night shift cleaning the docking bays." "A janitor," the king repeated, like he was testing the word. "You know what my children have done, Jake Miller." Jake shook his head, not trusting his voice. "They have bonded with you." Calitha's expression was unreadable. Dragon hatchlings bond only once in their lifetime. It is a sacred connection, formed only with those who save their lives or show them profound kindness in their most vulnerable moments. Once bonded, the connection lasts until death. They have chosen you as their guardian, their family. This cannot be undone. The Red Guard made an angry hissing sound. Sire, this is unprecedented. A human cannot be bonded to royal hatchlings. The shame to the Empire. Silence, Calitha said quietly, but the word carried such weight that the guard immediately stopped talking. The king moved closer until he was standing directly in front of Jake, so close that Jake could feel heat radiating off his scales. Let me tell you what confounds me about your species, Jake Miller. Humans are weak by every galactic standard. You have no natural weapons, no armor, no claws or venom or enhanced strength. Your lifespans are short. Your bodies are fragile. A single guard here could kill 100 humans without effort. Jake didn't know what to say to that, so he just stood there, trying not to shake too obviously. Yet you found my children dying and abandoned. You had nothing to gain from helping them. Indeed, you had everything to lose. You spent your own money, risked your safety, broke laws to nurse them back to health. The king tilted his head. Why? Because they needed help, Jake said simply. I couldn't just leave them to die. It wouldn't have been right. Right, Calitha repeated. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he did something completely unexpected. He laughed. It was a deep, rumbling sound that shook the walls of Jake's apartment. Right. A human concept. Tell me, in the week you had my children, did it occur to you to sell them? They would have been worth more money than you could spend in 10 lifetimes. No, Jake said immediately. They are not property. They are living beings. Kids. Did it occur to you to turn them in for a reward? The Empire would have paid handsomely. I thought about contacting your embassy, Jake admitted, but I was scared. Everyone said dragons don't distinguish between friend and enemy. I didn't want to die before making sure Ember and Ash were safe. The king's eyes seemed to glow brighter. You named them. I had to call them something, Jake said defensively. Ember chirped and nuzzled his cheek, as if agreeing. Calitha stepped back and seemed to come to some decision. The Empire owes you a life debt, Jake Miller. 2 life debts, in fact, 1 for each child. Name your price. Wealth beyond measure, a planet of your own, a seat on the Galactic Council. Most beings would demand these things and more. Jake looked at the Dragon King, then at Ember and Ash on his shoulders, then around his tiny apartment. His whole life was in this room. His whole small, insignificant life. And now he was being offered anything he could imagine. But only one question burned in his mind. Jake looked at the Dragon King standing in his tiny apartment, surrounded by guards who could end his life with a single thought, and he realized he didn't want wealth or planets or power. He wanted to understand something that had been bothering him since the moment he'd found Ember and Ash. I don't want payment, Jake said quietly. Ember chirped softly on his shoulder, like she approved. I'm just glad they are safe. But can I ask you something? Why didn't anyone else help them? In the week I had them, thousands of beings passed through this station. Hundreds walked right past that cargo container. Why didn't anyone else stop? The question hung in the air. The guard shifted uncomfortably. But Calitha's expression changed into something that might have been sadness or maybe respect. He gestured for his guards to wait outside. They hesitated, clearly unhappy about leaving their king alone with a human. But they obeyed. The door closed behind them, and suddenly the apartment felt a little less crowded. The Dragon King did something Jake never expected. He sat down on Jake's cheek couch, which creaked under his weight but held. It was such a normal, casual gesture that for a moment Jake forgot he was talking to one of the most powerful beings in the galaxy. Because they are not human, Calitha said simply, Sit, Jake Miller. You make me uncomfortable hovering there like a nervous prey animal. Jake sat in his desk chair, the only other seat in the apartment. Ember and Ash settled into his lap, curling up together like they'd done this 100 times. Let me tell you what we know about your species, the king continued. When Earth joined the galactic community 50 years ago, we studied you extensively. All the major powers did. We wanted to understand what kind of threat or asset you might become. He leaned forward slightly. Physically, humans are unremarkable. Mentally, you are intelligent but not exceptional. Technologically, you are centuries behind most spacefaring races. By every metric we use to evaluate species, humans should be irrelevant. Jake wasn't sure if he should be offended or not, but the king kept talking. Yet humans have a quality that appears nowhere else in the galaxy with such consistency. You help, even when it costs you, even when it gains you nothing, even when it puts you in danger. Calitha gestured around the apartment. You live in poverty by galactic standards. This dwelling is smaller than a storage closet on one of my ships. You work a job that most species consider beneath them. You have no power, no influence, no resources. And yet when you found my children dying, you didn't hesitate. Anyone would have done the same thing, Jake said. No, the king said firmly. That is where you are wrong. I have reviewed the station logs. In the 72 hours before you found that container, 243 beings passed within audible range of my children's cries. 57 walked directly past the container. Do you know how many stopped to investigate? Jake shook his head. 0. Not one. Because in the galaxy, Jake Miller, the dominant philosophy is simple. Not my problem. Not my species. Not my responsibility. This is considered wisdom. Those who involve themselves in others' affairs without benefit are considered foolish at best, dangerously naive at worst. The king stood and walked to Jake's small window, looking out at the station beyond. The conspirators who stole my children planned carefully. They knew I would search everywhere, so they hid them in the one place they thought was safe, among the crowds, among the indifferent masses of the galaxy, where cry for help is just background noise. He turned back to Jake, and his eyes were intense. They made one fatal miscalculation. They didn't account for the possibility that a human might find them, because humans operate on a different principle. You call it empathy, compassion. We have studied your history, your literature, your social structures. This pattern repeats endlessly. Humans who risk everything to save strangers, who adopt orphan animals from other species, who stop their vehicles to help injured creatures on roads, who protest injustice even when it doesn't affect them personally. Jake thought about that. He'd never really considered it a special human trait. It was just how things should be, wasn't it? This quality is why humans remain in positions like yours, Calitha continued. The galaxy sees your compassion as a weakness, a flaw to be exploited. When you apply for better positions, the evaluation programs flag you as emotionally compromised, likely to make decisions based on feelings rather than logic. This is why humans clean floors while less intelligent species command ships. That hit closer to home than Jake wanted to admit. He'd applied for dozens of better jobs over the years. Always rejected. Always some vague reason about not being the right fit. But here's what the galaxy fails to understand, the king said, and now his voice carried a weight that made Jake sit up straighter. Empathy is not weakness. It is the rarest form of strength. My empire is powerful. We have weapons that can destroy planets, ships that can cross the galaxy in days, warriors who are trained from hatching to be perfect killers. But we are feared, not loved, respected through strength, not trust. Calitha moved back to the couch and sat down again, his posture less formal now. I have ruled for 300 years. I have crushed rebellions, won wars, expanded our territory across 3 star systems. But I could not protect my own children from conspirators within my own court. I could not inspire the kind of loyalty that makes a powerless janitor risk everything to save strangers. Ember made a small sound and crawled up Jake's chest to lick his chin with her small forked tongue. It tickled, and despite everything, Jake smiled. Do you know what my intelligence officers told me when we traced my children here? The king asked. They said a human had taken them. They recommended immediate termination, because humans cannot be trusted with state secrets. But I overruled them. Do you know why? Jake shook his head. Because I have been watching your species for years, studying you, and I recognize something that the rest of the galaxy dismisses as foolishness. That same compassion that makes you save injured hatchlings also makes you exceptional diplomats, mediators, bridge builders between species who would otherwise never trust each other. You see people, Jake Miller, not resources, not threats, not tools, people. The king leaned forward. My empire needs allies, not just subjects. The galaxy is changing. Old powers are fading. New threats are emerging. And I have come to believe that humans, with your strained insistence on helping others, might be exactly what we need. Not as servants, not as janitors, as partners. Jake's mind was reeling. He'd expected to die tonight, or at best, to hand over Ember and Ash and go back to his quiet, invisible life. He hadn't expected this. A Dragon King sitting in his apartment, talking about humanity's potential like it was something valuable. "The bond my children formed with you cannot be broken," Calitha said. "In my culture, this creates certain obligations. Ember and Ash will grow. In 10 years, they will be as large as I am. In 50, they will be old enough to take positions of authority in the Empire, and they will never forget who saved them, who cared for them when they were helpless." The king stood, towering over Jake once more. "So I ask you again, Jake Miller, what do you want? Not for payment, but for your future. For their future. What kind of life do you envision?" Jake looked down at Ember and Ash, both watching him with those intelligent golden eyes. He thought about his tiny apartment, his dead-end job, his invisible existence. Then he thought about what the king had said, about humans being bridge builders, about compassion being strength. "I want to help," Jake said finally. "Not just Ember and Ash, but maybe make things better for other humans too. We're not weak or stupid or emotional. We're just different. And maybe that difference is worth something." Calitha's expression shifted into what Jake was pretty sure was a smile. For a dragon, that was a terrifying sight. All those teeth. "Then let me tell you what I propose." Calitha stood in Jake's tiny apartment, and what he said next changed everything. "I offer you the position of Royal Bonded," the king said. "It is a title that has not been awarded to anyone outside the Draconian bloodline in over 3 centuries. The last was a warrior from the Kethril species who saved the life of my great-grandfather. You would be given quarters in the royal palace, well sufficient for any need. And most importantly, you would help raise Ember and Ash as they grow. You would maintain the bond they have formed with you." Jake's mouth fell open. He looked down at the 2 hatchlings in his lap, then back up at the Dragon King. "I don't know anything about raising dragons." "Neither do most dragon parents when their eggs first hatch," Calitha said with what might have been amusement. "They would have nurses, tutors, guards, but they would also have you, the one they chose, the one they trust." He paused, his expression becoming more serious. "But there is more to this offer than just childcare." The king began pacing Jake's small apartment, his tail swishing behind him. "I told you that I have been studying humanity for years. I meant it. Your species has potential that the rest of the galaxy refuses to see because they are blinded by prejudice and outdated evaluation systems. They look at humans and see primitives who are too emotional, too soft, too attached to idealistic concepts like fairness and compassion." Jake stayed quiet, sensing the king was building towards something important. "But I see something different," Calitha continued. "I see a species that can walk into a room of hostile aliens and find common ground, that can negotiate peace between groups who have been enemies for generations, that can look at a problem and ask not how do we win, but how do we make this better for everyone." He stopped and faced Jake directly. "My empire is powerful, but we are not loved. We rule through strength, through fear, and that has served us well for millennia. But the galaxy is changing." The king moved to the window again, looking out at the stars beyond the station. "New threats are emerging. Old alliances are crumbling. And I have come to realize that strength alone will not be enough in the coming years. We need something my people have never been good at. We need to build genuine alliances. Real partnerships based on trust, not fear. And humans excel at this in ways we cannot." Jake was starting to understand where this was going, and it was both exciting and terrifying. "I want you to be more than just royal bonded," Calitha said, turning back to face him. "I want you to become my ambassador, not just to my people, but to the galaxy. Your role would be to help bridge the gap between species, to help integrate humanity into the galactic community not as servants or menial laborers, but as equals, as valued partners." "Me?" Jake's voice cracked slightly. "I'm a janitor. I barely finished my education. I don't know anything about diplomacy or politics or—" "You saved 2 dying children when you had nothing to gain and everything to lose," the king interrupted. "You spent money you could not afford to spend. You risked imprisonment or death. Not for reward, not for recognition, because it was the right thing to do. That quality, Jake Miller, is more valuable than any amount of political training. Ember chirped and climbed up to Jake's shoulder, nuzzling against his neck. Ash followed, taking his usual position on the other side. They'd done this so many times over the past week that it felt natural now, comfortable, like they belonged there. Jake looked around his apartment one last time. The cramped space that had been his whole world for 3 years. The job that made him invisible. The life that felt like it was going nowhere. And then he looked at the Dragon King offering him something he'd never even imagined wanting. But there was something else. Something important. "I'll accept," Jake said slowly. "But I have a condition." The guards outside must have heard that through the door, because Jake heard sharp hissing sounds. Nobody made conditions with the Dragon King. But Calitha merely raised one scaled eyebrow, waiting. "There are 237 humans working on this station," Jake said, his voice getting stronger as he spoke. "I know because I looked it up once. We're all in the same position, more or less. Cleaning, maintenance, waste management. Jobs that nobody else wants. We're treated like we're invisible or stupid or both. If I'm going to be your ambassador, if I'm going to help humanity find its place in the galaxy, then it has to start here. Every human on this station gets offered a real job, real opportunities, training for positions that match their actual abilities, not what some algorithm decided they're capable of." The apartment was dead silent. Jake could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. He'd probably just insulted one of the most powerful beings in the galaxy, made demands when he had no right to demand anything. But if he was going to do this, if he was going to represent humanity, then he needed to start by standing up for humans who were in the same position he'd been in just an hour ago. Calitha stared at him for a long moment. Then the Dragon King threw back his head and laughed. It was a deep, booming sound that shook the walls and probably woke up half the corridor. Ember and Ash joined in with their own chirping sounds, like they found the whole thing hilarious. "You bargain for others before yourself," the king said when he finally stopped laughing. His eyes were bright with what looked like genuine respect. "You are offered wealth and power and status, and your first thought is for fellow humans you have never met. Truly, Jake Miller, you are human." He stepped forward and extended one massive clawed hand. "Your condition is accepted. Every human on this station will be evaluated fairly and given opportunities based on their actual capabilities. You have my word as king." Jake stood up carefully, keeping Ember and Ash balanced on his shoulders, and shook the Dragon King's hand. The scales were warm and surprisingly smooth. The king's grip was gentle, carefully controlled, so those claws didn't pierce Jake's much softer skin. "Then I accept your offer," Jake said. "All of it. Royal bonded. Ambassador. Whatever you need me to be." "Excellent," Calitha said. He stepped back and gestured toward the door. "My ship is docked in Bay 12. We will leave within the hour. Gather whatever possessions you wish to bring. Everything else will be provided." Jake looked around his apartment again. He didn't really have much worth taking. Some clothes, his tablet, a few photos from Earth. It all fit in a single bag. 3 years of his life condensed into one backpack. As he packed, the king made some calls on a device that looked like it was grown rather than built. Jake heard him speaking in Draconian, giving orders. Something about accommodations, security protocols, informing the palace. This was really happening. In an hour, Jake Miller, night shift janitor, would be leaving this station on a royal dragon ship. Ember and Ash stayed on his shoulders the whole time, making happy chirping sounds. They knew something good was happening. They could probably feel his emotions through whatever bond they formed. Nervous excitement, fear of the unknown, but also hope. Real hope, for the first time in a long time. "One more thing," Calitha said as Jake zipped up his bag. "The conspirators who stole my children. They are still out there. Some are being captured, but others remain hidden within my court. You will be walking into a dangerous situation. There are those who will see your position as an insult to tradition, a human raised to such status. They may try to harm you." "I figured," Jake said. "Nothing worth doing is ever safe, right?" The king's expression softened slightly. "You will have protection, the best guard in the Empire, and you will have Ember and Ash. As they grow, they will become your greatest defenders. A bond mate is sacred in our culture. To harm you would be to declare war on them personally. Few would risk that. Jake nodded, trying to feel as confident as he was pretending to be. They walked out of the apartment together. The guards fell into formation around them, still looking unhappy about the situation, but following their king's orders. As they moved through the corridors toward the docking bay, people stopped and stared. A Dragon King walking through the lower residential levels was probably the strangest thing most of them had ever seen. Jake saw other humans in the crowd, cleaners finishing their shifts, maintenance workers. They looked at him with confusion and maybe a little envy. Tomorrow, their lives would change too. They'd get the opportunities they deserved, because one of their own had asked for it. The royal ship was massive, beautiful, and terrifying at the same time. It looked organic, like it had been grown rather than built, with scales that shimmered in the docking bay lights. The entrance ramp lowered as they approached. Jake paused at the bottom of the ramp and looked back at the station one last time. At the place where he'd been invisible, where he'd cleaned floors and emptied trash and been treated like he didn't matter. That life was over now. A door had closed. But as he climbed the ramp with Ember and Ash on his shoulders and the Dragon King beside him, Jake realized something else. Another door was opening, not just for him, but for all of humanity. The galaxy was about to learn what humans were really capable of. And it had all started because one human couldn't walk past creatures in pain. At the top of the ramp, Jake turned and took one last look at his old life. Then he stepped forward into his new one, ready for whatever came next. The door had opened, and humanity was finally walking through.